moving right along to the second verse of the portion. This is the lineage of Joseph. He was 17 years old, and he was Ben Shvasrei Shana Yeroes Achav Batzon. He was watching his brother's sheep. He was a shepherd with his brothers and with the flock. Vehu Naras B'nei Bilaves B'nei Zilpah Neshei Aviv, and he was a youth with the children of Bilhah and the children of Zilpah, the wives of his father. Vayeishev es tiba samra al avihem. And Joseph brought the bad tidings to their father. Tiba tamra, the evil tidings, the bad tidings to the father. So here, what I'd like to look at is the Rashi, and how do we understand this difficult Rashi? What are these evil reports that Joseph brought to his father? Rashi says, Kol ra'a shayaroeh be'achav. Every bad thing that he saw in his brothers, he would bring. He's saying he brought all the bad things. B'nei Leah haya magid le'aviv. So anything that he saw in his brothers, the children of Leah, he would tell his father. And then it says specifically what he would tell them. He would tell his father, Shaya Ochan Aver Menachai. He was telling his father that his brothers were eating Aver Menachai. What's Aver Menachai? These are the limbs of a living animal. They rip off the limbs of a living animal and eat it. You want a steak? No problem. We'll rip off the leg. They didn't have refrigeration, so they would just rip off the leg of a cow and eat it, and meanwhile the cow would still be alive. This is obviously a great sin, but they were doing that. Mezalzelin b'nei shefachos, and he said that his brothers were disparaging the children of the maids of Bilhah and Zilpah, l'kroson avodim, by calling them slaves. And then the third thing was chashudim al arayos. They were suspected of committing sexual sins. Uvishloshtan lakah. As a consequence, Joseph was himself punished in all three of these things. First of all, when he was sold, it says vayishchatu siyarizim. They slaughtered a goat when they sold him. V'lo achlu chai. They didn't eat it alive. Meaning to say, they didn't. It shows that they slaughtered. They weren't people who did aver menachai. They didn't do that. They were accused falsely because they slaughtered a goat. Bal diba shesiper aleim shekorin lachem avadim, and because he said that they called their brothers slaves, the verse says le'even nimkar Yosef. For this reason, Joseph was sold as a slave. Val rayot shesiper aleim, and then Joseph said they're committing sexual sins. This is exactly what Joseph was accused of. And she lifts up his eyes and she accused him. Because he accused them of committing the sexual sins, she accused him. So this midrash beautifully contrasts the later actions of Joseph. He was accused falsely of idolatry. He was called a slave when he really comes from noble background. And they slaughtered an animal in order to cover up for his sale. And says that he got these punishments working backwards because he accused his brothers of doing these actions. That's what Rashi says. The Baal HaTurim also, writing in the 14th century, comes up with a similar idea, but it says, he uses this through numerical value. He says, Tibatam Ra'ah, that the gematria of Dibatam Ra'ah is 721. And that is the equivalent of the numerical value of Shehem Achu Be'ever Menachai, that they ate from the flesh of the living animal. So he finds this idea hinted to in the scripture. Okay, I want to talk about this, but first we'll pause because I see that there's a question that begs the question, were Joseph's accusations false? How could, first of all, we have a problem here, because the principle is that the later commentaries don't want to suggest that these tzaddikim were sinners. And so therefore, we have a double problem. Either Joseph was lying, we don't want to say Joseph was lying, or the brothers were incredibly sinful people. We don't want to say that either. So the rabbis come to, I'm going to give you two answers that I saw in the rabbis, but the first answer is not the one that I find most interesting. It's the second answer that I find most interesting. But first, I'll tell you the first one. That this I found in a footnote to the Baal HaTurim's commentary. This is by the editor of the Baal HaTurim. He compiled this footnote, and it's Rabbi Avi Gold. And he writes, okay, how could the sons of Jacob have committed this sin of ripping the limb off of a living animal and eating it? It's a tremendous sin to do that. The Sanhedrin, the Talmud says that this is one of the 7 Noahide laws. So how could they have done this? And if they didn't, then how could Joseph have claimed they did? So some commentaries suggest that the brothers ate from a mifarcheses. Mifarcheses is the animal after you slaughter it. Has anybody here ever seen a chicken slaughtered or an animal slaughtered? You've never seen it? Okay, I've seen it many times. After it's slaughtered, it moves. It still moves. It's called the death rattle. It's called the death rattle. So some say that the status of such an animal is it's slaughtered, but yet it's also still alive. So according to that approach, technically speaking, this is a very technical answer. Since it's slaughtered, it may be eaten by a Jew, but the non-Jew can't eat it yet because it's still alive. So this is an interesting place where the Jew can eat it, but the non-Jew can't eat it. So therefore, Jacob's sons were of the opinion that that even though the Torah wasn't given yet, they were still status of Jews, and so when the animal was in its death rattle, they could eat it. Joseph said, "No, you're non-Jews. The Torah hasn't been given yet, so you can't eat it yet." Okay, so that's the first answer, that they were just basically arguing over a highly technical point in Jewish law. I said I'd share with you, it's not my favorite answer to the question. The answer that I think is very provocative is the following. This answer comes from the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, Kabbalistic source. So the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, writing in the 16th or 17th century, writes that the sons of Leah, by virtue of their status as the sons of the first wife, were privy to the Kabbalistic secrets of the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is really the original proto-work of Kabbalah, of mysticism, mystical magic. And so therefore, they created an animal by supernatural means. In fact, the Talmud in Sanhedrin 65b talks about such a situation where the sages created an animal through supernatural means and eat it. Such an animal, the prohibition against eating meat detached from a live animal does not apply to such an animal, through this animal created by supernatural means. So Joseph saw them eating from it, and he didn't realize that this was an animal that they were allowed to tear the limbs off from. Because this animal was created supernaturally. So even though it looked like an animal, it was exempt. It was a loophole. Now you might think, okay, this is completely irrelevant to my life. Why is Shmuel sharing Bubba Mises about an animal created supernaturally? It does, and through magic, and saying that the laws governing animals don't apply to it. This is the most irrelevant teaching in all of the more than 15 years many of us have been studying together. Aha! But this might be the most relevant teaching, because this is where I think that this should be a source that figures into the conversation as we look at one of the most interesting developments in food consumption, which is that we're going to start producing, we're already producing food in a laboratory. Food is being produced in the lab. We're producing meat and chicken and fish and animals in a lab from cells. And the question is, do the laws of meat apply to such animals, to such pieces that are not created in the normal biological manner? Let's say you produce a piece of pork. Maybe it's kosher. Maybe produce a piece of steak. Maybe it's considered to be meat and milk that you can eat with milk because it's not meat. Let's say you produce milk. Maybe it's not milk. Now, I think that this source is suggesting that the laws of kosher, the normal kosher laws don't apply to such animals. That the pig produced in the lab would be kosher. This source is suggesting that. In point of fact, I think every rabbi out there is going to be afraid to say that pig is kosher that's produced in the lab. But in point of fact, this source is saying that these are not considered to be under the normal dietary laws. That the normal dietary laws only apply to animals that are born in the normal biological manner, not animals that are created, quote unquote, magically, mystically. And so therefore, I think that this source is incredibly relevant for that position. And once we're suggesting that, let's just see how. So therefore, you would say that the chicken would be parv, could eat it with meat, or the OU is not going to. They can't accept this because there's going to be some rabbis who argue with it. But I'm saying, as a purely technical matter, I think that this is the law. And the reason why it's relevant, you say, well, who cares? It's not relevant. Nobody's going to actually rule this way. No, they won't rule this way as a baseline. But when all of a sudden it becomes on the margins where, let's say, some of that chicken gets mixed in with dairy or something, and then we're going to say, oh, it's not really a problem, and it's kosher. Or let's say somebody's in a prison or in the army, and that's the meat that they're serving. People will give a ruling under those extenuating circumstances that piece of pork is actually not pork and it's kosher and you could eat it. You'll see that. That's what I predict on the basis of sources like this. And in fact, the Kabbalistic sources say that in the time of the Mashiach, pig will be kosher. This is the type of I think development that they're referring to when the pig is created in a laboratory. So can you imagine that for 2,000 years, people have been reading this Sefer Yetzirah, and there have been cynics who are rolling their eyes and talking about a magically created animal by the brothers. Ha, 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 how can you ever have such a thing? And now we see it. Now we see it with our own eyes that it's happening every single day in factories. These are truly the wondrous times that are happening right in front of us. So that's the first way. That's the first thing. So then how does it explain the other two things that Joseph did? How do we explain how Joseph was denigrating the brothers and calling them slaves? And how does it explain that the sons of Leah were denigrating the other brothers and calling them slaves? And how does it explain that they were suspected of sexual sins? So you have to go to the other ways, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit. He would say, to explain the first one, he would suggest that the sons of Leah were involved in these discussions, these deeply Kabbalistic discussions, because they were the oldest children, and this deeply mystical tradition was being passed down to them. So they had these other sons leave the room because they didn't feel like that they could share these secrets with everyone. You had to be limited to, the eldest children from the first wife. But Yosef didn't realize, or he didn't accept, that they were excluded from the conversation. So that was what they were arguing about when he accused them of being called, of denigrating them as the sons of slaves. And then the third thing, how did it say that they were suspected of sexual sins? That we could say, okay, here also it's going to sound a little bit much, but according to this Kabbalistic source, we could say that the brothers is what Shnei Luchot HaBrit says. Following Sefer Yetzirah, we would say that the brothers created a human who was a form of a human female, and they were using it and they were walking along with it. And Joseph thought this was an actual woman. So you could see that the rabbis anticipated something that science fiction is clearly talking about today, how people are creating human beings like cloning or even in a laboratory. You can imagine how these things were not very, very far away at all, actually. If we could create a sheep, you could clone a human being, or you could create a human being, or you could create, through artificial intelligence, a robot that looks exactly like a human being through AI generated images. And so this is what the rabbis anticipated was a dispute between Joseph and his brothers. And so they both, it wasn't that Joseph saw them doing something that was bad, he saw them doing something which he thought was bad, but they were actually doing something which they thought was okay. Okay, so that's this second approach of how Joseph was able to bring bad reports to them. Just pause in case anybody has any questions about this.